Maternal Portrait in 1925. When researchers zoom in on the child's face, they are left speechless. At the Institute of Forensic Anthropology at the University of Chicago, Dr. Marcus Rivera examines a photograph that had just arrived as part of an anonymous donation. The image, taken in 1925, shows a young woman of approximately 25 years, holding a child of about 3 years in her arms. The scene appears to capture an intimate and tender moment between mother and son, both dressed in typical working-class clothing of the 1920s. The photograph had arrived accompanied by a typewritten note that simply said, "This image was taken in Detroit, Michigan, in March 1925. The truth about this family must be known. Look into the child's eyes." There was no signature, no return address, only a blurred Detroit postmark dated the previous week. Dr. Rivera specialized in historical victim identification and photographic evidence analysis, had seen thousands of family portraits from the early 20th century during his career. However, something about this particular image immediately strikes him as disturbing. The quality of the photograph is exceptional for the time period, with surprisingly sharp details that allow distinguishing every texture of the woman's dress and every curl of the child's hair. The woman in the photo has dark hair styled in soft waves characteristic of the 1920s and wears a simple cotton dress with an apron. Her expression is serene, but there's something in her eyes that suggests deep sadness, almost resignation. Her hands, clearly worked by manual labor, hold the child with a tenderness that contrasts with the tension visible in her posture. The child, with golden curls and rosy cheeks, appears at first glance to be a perfect example of childhood innocence. He's dressed in a white sailor suit, popular among children of the era, and his small hands rest confidently on the woman's arm. However, upon examining the image more carefully, Rivera notices that the child's eyes have an unusual expression for someone of his age. Intrigued by the anonymous note and the exceptional quality of the photograph, Rivera decides to deepen his investigation. Using modern digital analysis techniques, he begins to examine every detail of the image, especially the child's face, as the mysterious note had suggested. The next day, Rivera uses an ultra-high-resolution scanner to digitize the photograph. When he digitally enlarges the child's face, what he discovers sends a chill down his entire spine. The little boy's eyes, which at first glance seemed innocent and cheerful, under magnification, reveal something completely different. In the child's pupils, clearly visible under digital amplification, a scene is reflected that doesn't correspond with the domestic and apparently peaceful atmosphere of the portrait. Rivera can distinguish the silhouettes of what appear to be several adult figures standing around the child and woman. Figures that are not visible in the main frame of the photograph but are perfectly reflected in the little boy's eyes. Even more disturbing is the fact that one of these figures appears to be holding what is clearly a weapon. The reflected image, although tiny, is sharp enough to distinguish the unmistakable shape of a pistol pointing directly at the woman and child. The woman's apparently serene expression now takes on a completely different meaning. It's not peace that her face reflects, but controlled terror. Rivera immediately contacts his colleague, Dr. Sarah Chen, a specialist in photographic microevidence analysis and historical crime scene reconstruction. When Chen examines the enlarged image, she confirms Rivera's observations and adds additional details that make the situation even more sinister. "Look here," says Chen, pointing to the amplification of the child's eyes. "You can see there are at least 3 adult figures reflected. One of them is definitely armed, but notice the positions of the other 2. They're clearly blocking the room's exits. This isn't a normal photo session, Marcus. This is a hostage situation." Chen also notices additional details in the reflection, what appears to be professional photographic equipment, suggesting that whoever took this image was an experienced photographer, possibly deliberately documenting what was occurring. The exceptional quality of the photograph now makes sense. It had been taken by someone who wanted to preserve evidence of what was happening. The revelation completely transforms the perception of the image. What initially seemed to be a tender maternal portrait reveals itself as documentation of a crime in progress, with the mother and child as victims of a desperate situation. Armed with this new information, Rivera and Chen begin an exhaustive search through Detroit's criminal archives from the 1920s. The decade had been notorious in the city for prohibition-related violence, territorial wars between gangs, and kidnappings that had plagued wealthy families during the era of organized crime. Their investigations lead them to the Detroit Police Department archives. where they find records of an unsolved case that had baffled investigators for decades. In March 1925, Catherine Morrison, 24 years old, and her son Thomas, 3 years old, had disappeared from their apartment in the Corktown district without a trace. Catherine had been the wife of James Morrison, an accountant who worked for several establishments that, according to subsequent investigations, were fronts for alcohol smuggling operations. James had been found dead in the Detroit River 2 weeks before his family's disappearance, apparently murdered for refusing to alter account books to hide illegal profits from his employers. Police records show that Catherine had contacted authorities days before her disappearance, claiming she had received threats from men looking for documents that James had supposedly hidden before his death. According to her testimony, these men believed she knew the location of evidence that could incriminate prominent figures in smuggling operations. The detective in charge of the case, Robert Hayes, had meticulously documented his investigations. In his notes, Hayes wrote, "Mrs. Morrison insists that her husband had photographed compromising documents before his death and had hidden both the original documents and the photographs in a location that only she knew. The suspects apparently believe that by torturing her, they can obtain this information." The description in police records perfectly matches the scene reflected in young Thomas's eyes. Hayes had theorized that the kidnappers had decided to photographically document their interrogation, possibly to send proof of life to those who might be willing to pay ransom, or to use the images as evidence of their threats against others who might have valuable information. Rivera and Chen's investigation leads them to examine more deeply the identity of the photographer who had captured this image. Technical analysis of the photograph reveals specific characteristics that suggest the use of high-end professional equipment, particularly a large format camera with specialized lenses that were extremely expensive and uncommon in 1925. A search of Detroit's commercial records from the era reveals that only 3 photographic studios in the city had access to this type of equipment. One of these studios, Morrison Professional Photography, no family relation to the victims, had been owned by Vincent Morrison, a photographer who specialized in discreet documentation for private clients. FBI records, recently declassified, reveal that Vincent Morrison had been under surveillance since 1924 for his suspicious connections with criminal organizations. Apparently, Morrison not only photographed legitimate social events, but also provided documentation services for illegal activities, from blackmail evidence photographs to documentation of interrogations to intimidate potential victims. A report by federal agent Thomas Walker, dated April 1925, describes Morrison's operations. The subject operates as an independent photographer, but maintains regular connections with the city's most prominent smuggling organizations. Our sources indicate he provides photographic documentation services for threats, extortion, and other criminal acts. His work is particularly valued for the technical quality that allows using the images as effective evidence for intimidation. Rivera discovers that Morrison had disappeared from Detroit in May 1925, barely 2 months after the estimated date of the photograph. Immigration records show he had traveled to Mexico, from where he apparently had operated similar services for international criminal organizations until his death in 1934. The connection between the photographer and the kidnappers suggests that the documentation of Catherine and Thomas Morrison's interrogation had been part of a carefully planned operation, possibly designed not only to extract information, but also to create blackmail material against others who might have connections to the smuggling operations that James Morrison had been documenting. The repeated mention in police archives of documents that James Morrison had hidden before his death deeply intrigues Rivera. If these documents really existed and contained evidence of high-level criminal operations, they could explain not only Catherine and Thomas's kidnapping, but also why the case had never been officially solved. A deeper search into FBI archives reveals that James Morrison had not simply been an accountant employed by illegal establishments, but a federal informant who had been gathering evidence against a corruption network that extended from local smuggling operations to high-level government officials in Michigan and Ohio. According to federal archives, James had been secretly photographing financial documents, correspondence, and payment records that demonstrated connections between organized crime and prominent politicians, judges, and law enforcement officials. His work had been so meticulous that federal agents considered him their most valuable source for building cases against figures who had previously been untouchable. A confidential memorandum from the director of the FBI's Detroit office, dated 2 days before James's murder, warned, "Morrison has gathered evidence that could result in the prosecution of at least 12 prominent public figures, including 2 state judges and a congressman. However, we have received information that his cover has been compromised and his life is in immediate danger. The memorandum continued explaining that James had insisted on continuing his work despite the threats, but had taken precautions to hide copies of all his evidence in multiple locations. Morrison claims to have created a comprehensive archive of photographic evidence that he has hidden in locations known only to him and potentially his wife. This evidence reportedly includes not only financial records, but also photographs of meetings between criminal leaders and corrupt officials. The search for these documents had apparently been the real motivation behind Catherine and Thomas's kidnapping. The kidnappers weren't looking for ransom money, but information that could lead them to evidence that threatened to destroy a corruption network extending to the highest levels of state government. As Rivera and Chen deepen their investigation, they discover that the corruption network James Morrison had been documenting was even more extensive than FBI archives had initially suggested. Declassified documents reveal names of figures who had shaped Michigan politics for decades, all apparently connected through their financial links to smuggling operations. Among the names mentioned in FBI archives appear Governor William Henderson, State Attorney General Robert Carlyle, and at least 6 Michigan Supreme Court judges. According to the evidence James had been gathering, these officials had not only received regular bribes, but had actively participated in planning and protecting large-scale criminal operations. A particularly revealing document, dated February 1925, describes a meeting secretly photographed by James in which Governor Henderson had personally discussed territorial distribution of smuggling operations among different criminal organizations. According to FBI notes, James had managed to photograph this meeting from a hidden compartment in the building where it took place. Chen discovers additional evidence suggesting that James's murder and his family's kidnapping had been ordered directly from the governor's office. An intercepted telegram, sent from Lansing to Detroit the day before James's murder, contained the coded message: "The accountant problem must be permanently resolved before he can testify." The photograph of Catherine and Thomas, now understood in its complete context, represents not only documentation of an individual crime, but evidence of a conspiracy that had reached the highest levels of state government. The kidnappers had been operating with the protection and possibly direct orders from government officials who had everything to lose if James's evidence came to light. Rivera also discovers that the original police investigation had been deliberately sabotaged. Detective Robert Hayes, who had been investigating Catherine and Thomas's disappearance, had been abruptly transferred to a position in a small rural Michigan town barely a week after beginning his investigation. His case files had been accidentally destroyed in a police station fire 2 months after his transfer. More detailed analysis of the photograph using state-of-the-art digital enhancement techniques reveals additional details that paint an even more horrifying picture of what Catherine and Thomas Morrison had faced during their kidnapping. Rivera and Chen managed to extract additional information from the reflections in the child's eyes that had been impossible to detect with previous technology. The new amplifications show that the interrogation had been carried out in what appeared to be the basement of an industrial building, possibly a warehouse in Detroit's Port District. The reflections reveal the presence of equipment suggesting this had not been the first interrogation. There are tables with instruments that had clearly been designed for torture, and evidence that the room had been regularly used for this purpose. Even more disturbing is the discovery that Catherine shows visible signs of previous abuse. Marks on her arms, barely visible in the original photograph but clearly distinguishable under magnification, suggest she had been tortured for days before this image was taken. Her serene expression is now understood as the resignation of someone who had been broken by days of brutal interrogation. Little Thomas also shows signs of trauma. His posture, initially interpreted as a child's natural confidence in his mother's arms, under more detailed analysis, reveals the rigidity of someone who had witnessed incomprehensible violence. His small hands, which seemed to rest casually on Catherine's arm, actually grip her with the desperation of a terrified child. Chen discovers additional evidence that this photograph had been taken as part of a series. Marks in the background of the image suggest multiple photographs had been taken, possibly documenting the interrogation's progression. The professional quality of the image now has a sinister purpose. It had been designed to preserve detailed evidence of the victim's suffering, possibly to send to others as a warning. An analysis of the light in the photograph indicates it had been taken during daylight hours, suggesting the kidnapping and interrogation had lasted at least 24 hours when this image was captured. The presence of filtered natural light also allows Rivera to determine the approximate orientation of the building where the interrogation had occurred. Using information extracted from light analysis and architectural features visible in Thomas's eye reflections, Rivera and Chen begin searching for the location where the photograph had been taken. Light patterns suggest a basement with east-facing windows, and structural characteristics visible in the background indicate a building of typical 1920s industrial construction. A search of Detroit's historical records leads them to examine buildings in the Port District that had been operational during 1925. Property records reveal that several warehouses in the area had been rented by companies subsequently identified as fronts for smuggling operations. One of these buildings, the Miller Warehouse on Porter Street, had been owned by Great Lakes Import Company, a business that FBI records indicate had been a front operation run by the criminal organization known as the Purple Gang. Records show this building had been used not only to store contraband alcohol, but also as an interrogation center to deal with informants and competitors. Rivera discovers the building still exists, although it had been converted to luxury apartments in the 1980s. With help from local authorities, he obtains permission to examine the building's original basement. What they find there confirms their worst suspicions about what had happened to Catherine and Thomas Morrison. The basement, although renovated, still preserves architectural features that match exactly what they had observed in the photograph's reflections. More significantly, during the 1980s renovation, workers had found evidence of modifications that had clearly been designed for interrogations. Wall anchors for restraints, a drainage system that had been added to facilitate cleaning, and walls that had been soundproofed. Renovation records also document the discovery of several personal objects that had been left in hidden spaces of the basement, including pieces of jewelry, personal photographs, and other articles suggesting multiple victims had been held there for extended periods. Among these objects, Rivera finds a small child's shoe that matches exactly the style and size Thomas Morrison would have worn. The discovery of Thomas's shoe in the old warehouse basement provides Rivera with the physical confirmation he needed to definitively establish the connection between the photograph and the site where the crime had occurred. However, what they find next exceeds all their expectations and provides evidence that had been waiting decades to be discovered. During a more exhaustive search of the basement, using metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar, the team discovers a false wall that had remained hidden during the 1980s renovation. Behind this wall, they find a sealed room that had served as a secret archive for the Purple Gang. Inside this room are hundreds of photographs, documents, and other materials that had been used for blackmail and intimidation during the 1920s. Among this material, Rivera finds not only the complete series of Catherine and Thomas Morrison photographs, but also the original documents James Morrison had been gathering before his death. The complete photographic series documents horror that had lasted at least a week. The images show the interrogation's progression, from the first photographs where Catherine still shows resistance, to the final images where her spirit had clearly been broken by days of torture. Thomas appears in all photographs, forced to witness his mother's suffering as part of the intimidation strategy. The documents James had gathered are even more revealing than FBI archives had suggested. They include not only evidence of government corruption, but also details of criminal operations extending internationally, with connections to smuggling networks in Canada, Mexico, and Europe. A letter found among the documents, written by Catherine during her captivity, provides the final testimony of what had occurred. In the letter, addressed to whoever may find this, Catherine describes how she had been tortured to reveal the location of James's evidence, but had resisted because she knew that revealing the information would mean death for both her and Thomas. "I know we won't survive this," Catherine wrote with trembling handwriting. "But I also know that if I give them what they want, many more innocent people will die. James died trying to expose the truth, and I cannot betray his memory no matter what they do to me." The evidence discovered by Rivera and Chen triggers one of the largest historical investigations in Michigan's history. The documents found in the secret room not only confirm suspicions about 1920s government corruption, but also reveal connections to crimes that had remained unsolved for decades. The contemporary investigation discovers that several government officials implicated in the corruption network had continued their political careers for decades, with some reaching positions of national power. Although most had already died, their estates faced civil lawsuits from families of victims of crimes they had facilitated. The University of Michigan establishes the James Morrison Archive as a research center dedicated to documenting unsolved historical crimes and government corruption. The original photograph of Catherine and Thomas becomes the archive's central symbol, representing both the horror of committed crimes and the power of preserved evidence to eventually bring justice. Dorothy Morrison Chen, Catherine Morrison's great-granddaughter. The surname Chen coincidence had been the product of marriage, not a family relationship, emerges as the closest surviving descendant. She had sent the photograph anonymously after finding it among her great-grandmother's possessions, without fully understanding its significance but instinctively feeling it contained important secrets. The site of the old Miller warehouse becomes a memorial for Catherine, Thomas, and other victims, whose remains are eventually identified through modern forensic investigation. A memorial plaque reads, "In memory of Catherine Morrison, 1901-1925, and Thomas Morrison, 1922-1925, whose sacrifice preserved evidence that eventually exposed a corruption network that had plagued Michigan for decades." Rivera's investigation demonstrates that even after a century, no crime remains truly unpunished when evidence is preserved and analyzed with appropriate tools. The photograph, initially perceived as a tender maternal portrait, becomes testimony to the power of modern technology to reveal truths that had been literally hidden in plain sight. The story of Catherine and Thomas Morrison inspires new cold case investigations throughout the country, using advanced digital analysis techniques to examine historical photographic evidence that had previously been considered completely analyzed. Their legacy lives not only in the justice finally achieved, but in the demonstration that truth, no matter how long it remains hidden, will eventually prevail when dedicated individuals commit themselves to seeking